the Democrats going with this. If Mondami is the face of the Democrats on the East Coast and Katie Porter is the face on the West Coast, I don't know if that's great politically for that party. Democratic socialism is like a dating profile. Things look great until you meet up in the real world. For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor in the Oval Office last week.
It appears Democrats are edging toward more socialist policies, and Bill Maher warns that direction could harm the party. The comedian offered a direct caution. Embracing expanded government platforms may distance moderate voters and complicate prospects in 2028. His remarks were firm yet measured. For viewers seeking thoughtful analysis, consider subscribing for more in-depth discussion.
The party has a clear choice here, very clear. One wing is saying don't ever use the word socialist again, and one is saying,
I am a democratic socialist.
Clear, huh? So how do we decide who's right? Well, it turns out we don't really have to flip a coin. We have the evidence. In 2024, 13 Democrats won. In districts, Trump also won. All moderates. This isn't rocket science. All the left-leaning think tanks have done autopsies on 2024, and they all came up with the same message: move to the center. Even the New York Times, which did so much to promote woke politics, now says the partisans are wrong. Moving to the center is the way to win. And Democrats should recognize the party moved too far left on social issues after Obama left
Bill Maher
office.
speaks plainly. He cautions that if Democrats keep moving toward more overtly socialist positions, they could unintentionally hand Republicans a significant advantage. From his perspective, adopting labels and proposals that many voters still see as divisive may motivate conservative turnout, consolidate the GOP base, and reinforce their hold on the White House, instead of broadening Democratic support. Maher contends that rather than expanding their coalition, Democrats might narrow it, effectively giving Republicans a compelling campaign argument. His recommendation is direct but tactical: recalibrate toward the political center. He argues the Democratic National Committee should focus on practical, everyday concerns that connect with moderates and independents, rather than emphasizing ideological litmus tests. In his view, electoral success depends less on energizing the most vocal online factions and more on assembling a wide-ranging coalition. For 2028 competitiveness, he suggests moderation over confrontation.
Oh, the kids think that stuff that happened before their appearance on the planet didn't really happen, but it did. We've run this experiment many times, and the results are always obvious. Here's capitalist South Korea at night from space. Here's socialist North Korea. Yeah. In 1990, Venezuela was wealthier than Poland, but then Poland, finally free of Soviet-style economics, went all in on capitalism, and now their economy is as big as Japan. And people there have high wages, low inflation, cars, vacations, homes. Meanwhile, Venezuela traded capitalism for Hugo Chavez's socialism for the 21st century, which turned out to be like socialism in the last century, or any century.
Bill Maher maintains that socialism remains politically untenable in the United States because a large share of Americans view it with caution. He argues that voters do not require a detailed history seminar to form opinions. In his assessment, many people look at large-scale socialist policies implemented abroad and connect them with economic slowdowns, supply constraints, or expanded state authority. Maher suggests that, fair or not, these associations shape how the term is received domestically. The perception, he notes, carries significant weight. In electoral politics, perception can be decisive. Maher believes many voters are uneasy with proposals that seem to concentrate extensive control within federal institutions. After decades of emphasizing market competition and personal initiative, segments of the electorate remain hesitant about sweeping ideological transitions. He contends that publicly aligning with socialism could distance swing voters in a closely contested national election. Even modest shifts among moderates, he argues, might alter the outcome in a presidential race.
Turned one of Latin America's richest countries into one of its poorest. Low wages, high inflation, shortages, outages, 8 million people fleeing. If you think New York can somehow reinvent this wheel, you're in for a rude awakening. Zoran can't make your wishes come true. You're thinking of Zoltar.
Maher highlights what he considers a developing example in New York, where some Democratic voters have supported candidates who openly describe themselves as democratic socialists, including Zoran Mamdani. For Maher, this represents more than a local contest. He sees it as a potential indicator of how similar positioning could resonate nationally if the party continues in that direction. He interprets Mamdani's emergence as part of a wider ideological evolution that may energize committed activists while creating uncertainty among moderates who often determine general election outcomes. Maher suggests that political history contains warnings about heavily branded ideological campaigns, noting that candidates perceived as too closely aligned with a single doctrine may face challenges sustaining broad public trust. Although Mamdani's future influence in New York is still unclear, Maher anticipates that practical governance will matter more than campaign rhetoric. In his assessment, tangible results rather than slogans ultimately shape voter decisions in competitive elections.
Democratic socialism is like a dating profile. Things look great until you meet up in the real world. For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor in the Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mamdani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're democratic socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think people know that yet.
Maher argues this is where, in his view, a misunderstanding can take hold. Some voters believe the term democratic socialist represents a clear break from traditional socialism, assuming that adding the democratic word significantly reshapes the ideology. According to Maher and others who share his perspective, that distinction may be more about presentation than substance. They contend that pairing democratic with the label doesn't fundamentally change core proposals, such as expanded federal involvement, wealth redistribution measures, or a broader governmental role in managing economic activity. Supporters of democratic socialism emphasize that their agenda operates within constitutional and electoral systems rather than authoritarian structures. Maher, however, suggests that once enacted, certain policies could produce outcomes that resemble elements associated with older socialist models. He maintains that terminology can influence public reception, making ideas seem more approachable at first glance. Ultimately, he cautions that voters tend to evaluate tangible results over branding. If policies align with concerns many Americans already hold, he argues, revised language alone may not prevent political repercussions.
I think people realize we already have a lot of socialism. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, food stamps, veterans benefits, Pell Grants, COVID-era payments, farm subsidies, disability payments, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, corporate bailouts, and the jobs program that is building weapons the Pentagon doesn't even want. All that is socialism, much of it appropriate to soften the edges of capitalism, but the DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. They're for what Biden was doing, but more. You think you're going to win an election on that?
Bill Maher also identifies immigration as a significant political weak point. He observes that some voters pointed to what they considered insufficient border enforcement during Joe Biden's administration as a reason they lost trust in Democratic leadership. For those voters, border policy represented more than theory. It became a measure of effectiveness, stability, and responsibility. Maher argues that when citizens believe key systems are not being managed effectively, they may explore alternatives, even if they hold reservations about those options elsewhere. He expresses concern that certain democratic socialist figures continue to advocate positions that, in his assessment, were not well received by segments of the electorate. From his standpoint, that may suggest the party has not fully internalized earlier electoral feedback. He cautions that maintaining a similar strategy while anticipating different outcomes could prove risky, particularly in a politically divided environment where public perception can strongly influence results.
Defund the police or military in the streets. Either MAGA's crypto crony capitalism or city-run grocery stores. No, I don't want that. I want a Democrat who reassures me if you like your Whole Foods, you can keep your Whole Foods. Governor-elect Spanberger once said about Biden's presidency that, quote, nobody elected him to be FDR. They elected him to be normal. Normal. You know, at this year's DSA convention, or as it's commonly known, Comic-Con, get this, you had to submit a photo of a negative COVID test to get in. In 2025. Yeah, no one wants to do that.
Bill Maher distills his guidance to Democrats into a straightforward idea: project normalcy. In his assessment, the party does not require dramatic ideological shifts or cross-party cultural battles to compete effectively in 2028. Instead, he argues for consistency, practical problem-solving, and a tone aligned with everyday realities. Maher has often expressed concern about messaging he views as overly activist or rhetorically intense, suggesting it may distance more voters than it motivates. He contends that many Americans prioritize steady governance over symbolic debates or online visibility. Issues such as employment, inflation, public safety, and upward mobility, he believes, resonate more broadly. When political communication appears detached from daily experiences, Maher warns that voters may disengage or reconsider their support. His position, as he frames it, is not about discarding foundational principles, but about emphasis and delivery. He characterizes moderation as a strategic choice rather than a retreat, arguing that wider appeal requires language and priorities reflective of the broader electorate.
It seems to me that there are two pillars that this country is founded on. One is democracy, and one is capitalism, free markets. And it seems like one party wants to get rid of one, and the other party wants to get rid of the other. Right? The Republicans are not that, democracy is just not number one on their list. It just isn't. It isn't. It's behind Christianity and a few other things. And the Democrats, I mean, I read these 74% are for democratic socialism. Only 16% favor capitalism. Is this going to be a country that I don't recognize in 5 to 10 years if we don't have these two pillars?
Bill Maher has said he is surprised by survey results indicating that a notable share of Democratic voters express openness to socialism. In his view, that level of receptiveness carries political risk because the term remains highly contested within American discourse. Maher maintains that socialism is often linked, fairly or not, to historical examples where centralized economic structures faced challenges such as inefficiency or slowed growth. He maintains that even if those comparisons require nuance, public perception alone can influence electoral outcomes. From his perspective, some voters associate the label with diminished opportunity or economic strain. He cautions that this perception could provide Republican candidates with a clear line of attack in national campaigns. Maher does not suggest that all progressive proposals lead to systemic failure, but he emphasizes that terminology shapes political framing. If Democrats more closely align themselves with a label many voters question, he argues, opponents may find it easier to craft a resident campaign message.
The Democrats going with this. If Mondami is the face of the Democrats on the East Coast and Katie Porter is the face on the West Coast, I don't know if that's great politically for that party.
Some observers say they do not view the emergence of figures such as Zoran Mamdani and Katie Porter as an unequivocally positive development for Democrats. Critics contend their prominence may signal a broader ideological shift toward democratic socialism, a direction that could create unease among moderates and independent voters. Rather than expanding the party's reach, these critics argue, it could compress the coalition and amplify Republican messaging. The debate, they suggest, extends beyond individual candidates to the overall trajectory of the party's identity. When voters interpret movement away from pragmatic positioning toward more defined ideological branding, overall confidence may decline. Whether such concerns will materialize is unclear. Still, the discussion highlights an ongoing internal conversation about identity, electability, and long-term strategy. Some commentators caution that without careful balance and broader engagement, the party's competitiveness in future national elections could gradually diminish.
Democratic socialists at another of their conventions, they were told to make jazz hands instead of clapping, lest some delegates suffer sensory overload. And also, and I'm not joking, they were told not to be wearing, any aggressive scents.
please don't go into that space with anything that's like an aggressive scent, for instance, right? Because that's going to be difficult for people.
Oh, for f***'s sake.
Bill Maher has openly criticized what he describes as the Democratic Party's increasing emphasis on what is often labeled woke politics. In his assessment, this focus represents more than a cultural conversation. He sees it as a potential electoral drawback. Maher argues that when leaders appear to prioritize symbolic disputes or highly specific ideological debates over everyday economic and social concerns, some voters may feel disconnected. He suggests dissatisfaction can grow quietly among people who are primarily looking for practical, workable solutions to tangible problems. What concerns Maher most, he explains, is the combination of messages. He contends that aligning a more expansive government-centered economic platform with assertive cultural progressivism can create a perception of ideological overreach. Whether that characterization is fully accurate or not, he maintains that political perception carries weight. In competitive elections, he notes, broad coalitions are often decisive, and any movement perceived as outside the mainstream may narrow appeal. For Maher, the strategic response is not escalation, but adjustment. He argues that recalibration is necessary before frustration translates into votes for opposing candidates. Ultimately, he cautions that drifting too far from the political center could erode public confidence. In his view, moderation, practical governance, and relatability are more reliable paths to remaining competitive in 2028 and beyond. And this brings us to the end of today's video. If you found this analysis helpful, consider liking the video and subscribing for more discussions like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.